Welcome back to the show, everyone. Today, my guest on Wealth Formula Podcast is David Denniston. He's author. He's an author. He's a tax consultant and a financial consultant, and he's also the host of Freedom Formula for Physicians podcast, and which basically teaches physicians how they can engage in a healthy and prosperous mindset. So, Dave, welcome to Wealth Formula Podcast.
Hey Buck, so glad to be here. It's always fun, you listen to someone on their podcast, then you actually get to speak to them live.
Oh
There's
well,
nothing like it. It's pretty cool.
that's good. I didn't know you listened, but that's kind of you to say. So I have to admit, given the name of your podcast, when I initially contacted you, and we were just talking about each other's shows and that sort of thing, I thought you were going to be a physician because your show is about your freedom formula for physicians, right? So tell us a little bit about your background and how you started your show, and I guess ultimately how you focused on doctors.
Yeah, so I'm from Southern California originally, grew up in Orange County and LA County, and made my way up to Seattle for college. And about 10 years ago, made an business acquisition that brought me from Washington all the way to Minnesota. So I keep on getting colder all the time.
Yes. Well, we know a thing or two about Minnesota and the Vikings and everything like that on this show. We talk about it sometimes.
They were heartbroken this year, I'll tell you. It
Yeah,
was
yeah.
a lot of heartbroken people here, which I suppose you're used to, right? Growing up here in Minnesota, it's not an unusual thing.
Well, for better or for worse, I was born in I was born in 1973. The last time the Vikings were in the Super Bowl, I think was 19. I want to say 1977, and I think I started watching football the next year, and I was about 4 years old. 4 or 5 years old. So I never actually got the heartbreak of a Viking Super Bowl loss, but there was four of them, and we haven't been back since my memory has been clear. So hopefully that'll change sometime in the future.
Yeah, we'll see what happens. I'm a basketball guy. The Lakers are my team growing up in Southern California. But the whole inspiration for me starting the podcast and kind of my focus on doctors and giving back to the community really stems from my personal experiences. You see, what happened was my wife and I have two daughters. One is turning 13 shortly. The other is just turned 6. And with the oldest, my wife had toxemia and preeclampsia, but it wasn't until postpartum that
Mm-hmm.
got diagnosed. So she had horrible seizures the
Yeah,
first time around, and was
yeah.
not a lot of fun. So we took a break between kids and wanted to get pregnant again, and it took a while. It was a hard time to get pregnant. My wife finally gets pregnant, and oh my gosh, from the start of it, it was just not a lot of fun. It got to the point about, I would say, 15, 16, 17 weeks in gestation. And my wife was starting to get horrible headaches and was getting blurred vision. And we were in and out of the hospital. No one could really tell us what was going on. I kept on telling them, watch for
Yeah,
toxemia.
yeah, yeah.
And they couldn't clinically diagnose it.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was a lot of ins and outs. And she ended up getting admitted to the hospital at about 21 weeks in gestation or so. And then, as they were doing ultrasounds, they found out that the blood flow was starting to slow between my
Mm-hmm.
wife and my little daughter.
Sure.
And we hit this point where we were talking to the neonatology fellow and the neonatologist, and they basically told us, you need to make a decision here. You can try and ride this thing out, but there's a good chance you might lose the baby. Or you can go ahead, this was at 23 weeks in gestation now, or you can go ahead and try and take her out. And being the numbers nerd that I am, I said, well, what's the chances? What's the probability?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
and they said usually less than about 30%,
Right,
right? So we're looking at each other, and you're just lost in this moment.
right.
And we decided to move forward with it. And she was diagnosed officially by that time with having toxemia. by the
Right.
way.
Right.
So finally, which was apparently 7 weeks earlier than clinically it should show up.
Mm.
So I'm there in the operating room. They take this little tiny, tiny thing out, and she literally could fit in your hand at the time, one hand. And she makes a squawk. They run her over to the other side of the operating room, and they're trying to get a tiny, tiny breathing through tube down her throat. And I'm right there filming the whole thing, just praying and using my faith to make it through this moment. And lo and behold, they got that breathing tube down her throat, and she was 12.4 ounces.
Wow.
She was less than a pound when she came in this world, and she made it. We were in the NICU for about 5 months afterwards, 4.5 months. And so I spent a lot of time in the hospital, got to really know a lot of doctors and nurses and fellows and residents. And you know what? I said I really wanted to give back. And so that's been my mission of writing the books and having the podcast, which, as you know, these things for many of us don't really monetize all that well. So I've been at it 4 years plus, and it's been a great journey, meeting all kinds of great people like yourself on this mission to help doctors slash their debt, slash their taxes, and live a liberated lifestyle.
What? Tell me the name of the books, because I, for some reason, I didn't know about that.
Yeah, so there's the Freedom Formula for Physicians is what I call my first big book. I have another one called The Tax Reduction Prescription, and then the latest one is The Young Physician's Guide to Money and Life. So that's my latest book that just came out about a month and a half ago.
Got it. So let's talk a little bit about the Freedom Formula, right? I mean, so in your view, what is the Freedom Formula? Where do you start? How do you get this thing, and what is freedom anyway?
Right. Well, definitely you address this a lot in your podcast, and I think there's a lot of different formulas, and we really cover this quite a bit in the podcast. And there's really kind of two schools of thought, which is you go with piles of cash or you go with streams of income. And so I have guests on that talk about each of those, and I kind of lie somewhere in the middle, to tell you the truth. I like developing piles of cash, but I love having rivers of income. And I know many people starting out, probably piles of cash is the right way to go, in my opinion. But as you grow in wealth and assets, doing some of the kinds of things that you talk about here on the show quite a bit, I think is a great way to diversify and really not just be financially free, but to pass on generational wealth.
Right.
So, piles of cash is a great way to retire. But by itself, for most of us, it's not going to be enough to really generate substantial wealth that we can pass on to our kids and make a difference in this world with.
So piles of cash, you think you would say are the end point?
It could be.
What if you outlive the pile of cash?
What do you do with it, right? You like Scrooge
listen, I kept getting these things on Facebook for Elysium, this basis. I don't know if you know what that is, but it's basically NAD plus, and there's an MIT, there's an MIT big time MIT researcher behind it. He skipped the whole food and drug thing, and so they could get it out. And now a bunch of doctors are taking this stuff, and we all think it's going to make us live longer. So I say that just because I'm like, well, fundamentally, my issue with that paradigm is the idea of trying to figure out exactly how much you're going to need in order not to outlive it. I mean, MassMutual did a study some years ago, and that study showed that people who are baby boomers right now are more afraid of outliving their money than they are of death. And that's for good reason. So that's kind of what I wonder about. And believe me, I'm not just a cash flow guy, and people who listen to this show know this, is I'm all about, creating wealth with velocity and with mass and with leverage. But, ending up with a finite amount of money and hoping to live, I think White Coat Investors talks about 4% per year and living below your means because you don't need that much money anymore. I think it's a bunch of BS. And so So my concern about that model is, okay, well, people are living longer, inflation is going up. What are you going to do with a pile of money? And what then aren't you just kind of hoping to die before you finish it? I mean, how do you respond to that? I'm curious.
Well, I think that if you look at many different situations, I think that there's validity in both the piles of cash and rivers of income. So let me talk about why I think it's still a good idea for some people. I think number one, and I'm not going to get into all the details of the
Sure.
different kinds of investment vehicles, but basically, I mean, there's plenty of people that have done that just fine. And really, what it comes down to is living within your means, right? There's people that have a spending addiction. People that have spending problems are going to have a very difficult time saving for either of those methods. And so if your living expenses are, let's say, $50,000 a year, right? You need a much less pile of cash to sustain yourself than someone that has $100,000 living expenses per year. So that's I think and reality is the kind of assets you can invest into in pile of cash, they're not going to be going away anytime soon. Those kind of things have been existing for 100+ years. And really most investments come down to either owning something or someone owing you money, right? It's the equity or the debt side of the equation. And some people do a mix of the two. So, some people could make the argument that different kinds of assets are going to be going down over the next 10 years or whatever. I tend to believe and be more optimistic that I think things will work out over time and that people could be just fine pursuing that because things are going to change. If you look at the different way things are constructed, what were in those kinds of investments 100 years ago is totally different than the way it is today. So as the economy moves and changes, those kinds of investments will move and change too. They're not just going to be static.
Right.
They will move with time.
So let's talk about that whole living within your means thing. Because again, I hear this argument too is like, what we're trying to do is we're trying to put money away and then, basically, we won't need as much money to live on later. Do you feel like that's a good way to live?
Well, I think
I'll be honest with you. To me, that is like one of my pet peeves because I hear people say that all the time, which is like, they're putting money away into the IRA because the idea is that you're going to be in a lower tax bracket someday when your kids are out of the house and you're retired. Well, I don't want to be poor. I don't want to make like a quarter of what I do and live on that when I'm retired. Is that really fundamentally? I mean, and I know again the White Coat Investor has got an entire show on this, which honestly gives me palpitations when I hear it. But is that what you're talking about? Is that what you're talking about?
For some people, that works great, right? I mean, we can't
deny. How do you know? How do you know that past performance does not dictate future results? Right.
Well, that's true.
So you're saying that. Well, that's very true. But what you're doing is you're throwing things totally to the wind here, right? You're saying just because things worked 100 years ago, even though I don't exactly know how much money I need, even though I don't exactly know which way these equity markets work, or even what the equity markets really are, why something can have a PE ratio of 200, even despite that, you should just trust in it. Rather than necessarily saying, hey, I want to invest in something I understand, something that I own that's tangible, that people are going to need to live in, or people are going to, that is going to be something that I can have that's tangibly wealth, as opposed to a piece of paper. So that's my question. It's really an issue of control for me, right? Because when you're just investing in the markets and you're doing all this, stocks, bonds, and mutual funds, and you start saying 7% in this bucket and that percent in this bucket and all that, where the heck are these buckets coming from? What's that track record? And ultimately, aren't we just trying to like, make up these things to make ourselves feel better and about predicting the future?
Well, I think that's true of everything too, including real assets,
Ah,
right?
I
I mean,
disagree. I disagree. I can tell you exactly right now that if I want to right now, I can retire today.
well,
Right?
here's
Why?
here's the
Because I have
fall
over $1 million
here's
in passive income.
here's the fallacy in both, is that many people make the assumption, whether we're talking real assets or paper assets, that what the value is today is going to be the same 5 years, 10 years, 20 years down the road, because we know that assets get overheated, right? And
Sure.
I say financial freedom is really defined at the bottom of the cycle. If you still have financial freedom in a recession where your assets and the income you're generating from your assets or the amount you're taking out of your assets is sustainable, now you have true financial freedom. If you're measuring yourself at the top, whether you're talking real assets like real estate or paper assets, that is a fallacious argument for me, because more than likely things can go down, right? You can lose tenants in a bad economy. Rents can go down.
Sure, you
Different
can.
kinds of assets that you're
Absolutely.
relying on,
And so I
can
wouldn't
change.
argue that you shouldn't be smart about your investments, but I think the point is that what I'm saying is that there are those kinds of risks that are asset specific, and then and those are localized risks to some degree. You just didn't plan it very well. And then there's this entire risk of a bank failure that collapses all the equity markets, and you've got no income coming out of there to begin with, and the only thing that you can do is liquidate
Well,
that.
reality is that's true in both worlds,
Well,
because if you look at the '08 crash, which I know is when you started getting more into alternatives, you had so many alternative assets that went bankrupt because they were over leveraged, right? Real assets, people lost their shirt on those things, as well as in other places. So I don't buy that argument that real assets are always better. It's just a different kind of asset
well,
class. But
I want to be clear. I think our what we're talking about is very different. When I'm buying real assets, I'm making sure that I've got a significant spread in income. So generally speaking, if I do lose tenants, and I don't buy single family homes specifically because I don't want a 0 versus 100% occupancy situation, but the real question ends up being, do I have enough income to survive, survive this downturn? And I'll tell you that even though that I didn't have money in 2008, my dad's been a real estate investor for 50 years. He's been a cash flow investor. In 2008, he increased his monthly income by $50,000 to $60,000 per month because there were people who didn't buy smart. When we talk about investing, we're talking about investing. We're not talking about, you know, yeah, flipping homes. That's not what we're talking about. And a lot of people, I think, on the traditional side of things, think about us investors as out there flipping and stuff. No, we're investing. We're buying things that throw off income, and in worst case scenario, maybe they don't throw off as much income, but we can hold on to them, and eventually they will start throwing income off again. So that's, I mean, listen, it's at the end of the day, it's, I think, it's one of those things that we can certainly, agree to disagree on, but
well, like I said, I believe doing in both, right?
yeah.
So I'm saying don't rely on one strategy too much. Diversify yourself. And as you know from myself, for me, I choose to invest more in businesses.
Mm-hmm.
So that's more my strategy personally on the rivers of income side, because of what you mentioned before of the control. For me personally, I don't like the idea of pooling my money with other investors and then giving control of my money to someone else. I would rather have control over what I do. Not that it might always work out. Sometimes it won't, but at least I have
Do you mean
control
your own
over it.
businesses, or you're investing in other people's businesses, or what do you mean by that?
I invest in my own businesses. I
Right.
don't invest in other people's
Right,
businesses.
right.
I
Well, I was
make
going
an
to say
acquisition
investing in other people's
before I grow.
businesses is pretty challenging to do, and that's something that I have not been able to. And believe me, I invest in my own businesses as well. I mean, I have several businesses, but at some point you have to figure out where you're going to get the slow burn. And for me, that certainly my belief in that is for the most part in real estate. But let's talk a little bit about the economy right now. How do you think How do you think things are going? Where this is going to end up?
Well, listen, I mean, I don't know, right? None of
Yeah.
us do. Let's be real.
Yeah.
I don't know. You don't know. But from my study of it, best I can see, I think for the foreseeable future of the next 6 months, everything should be okay. But listen, there can always be shocks to the system. This whole tariff thing could come falling down on us as they get into a trade war. You know, none of us want that, but that would be bad.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's the whole North Korea thing, and who the heck knows what's going to happen there. But listen, you can't plan your life based on fear.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Yeah.
if you want to get anywhere in this world, you have to take risks, regardless of what the geopolitical or economic situation is. Now, I'll say that I think now is a great time to accumulate some cash because we know we're longer in the economic cycle in general. We're not at the bottom, right? I think we can all agree on that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So at some point, it's going to happen again. Is that 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years? I have no clue. But, you know, if you look at the famous investors, whether it's Warren Buffett or different people that did well in the last recession, it was because they had cash to deploy and buy stuff at a fat discount.
Right.
So I think you have to be ready to have cash on the sidelines for when this next time comes. And more than likely, we're probably in the 7th or 8th inning. I would think this might go on another year. Obviously, the tax cuts give some economic juice in the short term, which we'll probably see more of around tax time next year, particularly for those of us that own businesses. You know, we're going to have a 20%, many of us, 20% extra in our bank from the business with some of those things that are going on.
I don't think the doctors get that one.
What's that?
I don't think the doctors get that one, do they?
Under a certain income, they do.
No.
So it depends on how much.
I thought it depended on the practice or the type of business, and that medicine counted as a service business, so it didn't get that.
Service businesses under $300,000 income are still eligible.
Okay, got it.
If you're over 300K or so, I'd have to look at the exact numbers, but it's somewhere around there.
Got it.
That then you start phasing out. I think it's 400K when the phase out stops. Again, I'm just talking off the top of my head.
Yeah, no, I knew there was a phase out, but I thought there were some businesses that were completely ruled out of that, and that medicine was one of them. But I totally could be wrong.
From my study of it, no, they weren't completely phased out. They just have a lower threshold than other kinds of businesses.
Got it. So, so talk about that tax bill a little bit. What do you think? How does that change anything or everything in terms of the economy, in terms of the way you should invest right now, et cetera?
Well, certainly, I'd say there's geographical arbitrage. If you live in Texas, Washington State, states that Florida, states that have no state income tax, you are doing great.
Right.
You have a huge advantage in this because you have those itemized deductions. Now you are capped at $10,000 of state income taxes and property taxes within that tax bill. So if you're making, like most of us listening to the show, $300,000, you're going to get capped out if you live in a state with state income taxes. If you have kids, you're probably going to do fairly well with the tax bill. So the worst scenario is probably someone that's single, that lives in like New York or Minnesota or one of our states, Hawaii, that has a very high income tax bill. You might actually pay a little bit more in taxes. In the podcast, I actually went through 7 different episodes where I went through about 10 different scenarios of who wins and who loses from the tax bill. So in terms of investing, business owners make out the best. People that own real estate do pretty well with the tax bill. If you run a hedge fund, you're still doing pretty well with the tax bill because they didn't get rid of the can't remember the name of the exact term, but carry tax, where you get taxed at capital gains rather than at your ordinary income.
Right. So in terms of what kinds of tips do you have in terms of potential deductions? Because I know you do some tax work too. Do you have any pearls for us on there?
Well, I think S corporations are a huge win still, because you could be subject to the 20% type rule. One of the things that I think people should think about, like here I have a land flipping business and I have a service-based business. I actually might be better off separating those two. Currently, they're all combined in one.
Mm-hmm.
But as we get on later in this year, I'm going to be looking at separating the two because I'm going to have more tax advantages in the land flipping business over the service-based businesses, because of some of the things we were just talking about earlier, where service-based businesses have a cap essentially on them. So if you have multiple streams of income, multiple businesses, you really want to take a strong look at maybe separating some of those businesses out.
Yeah, yeah. There's also recently had somebody on the show who was giving some tips about, even with the deductions in terms of charitable deductions, being able to create some kind of a trust and contribute more to that. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Well, those things haven't changed in terms of charitable deductions, because you can still itemize if you have enough of them. So
Right.
the same strategies for charitable stuff is the same last year as it is this year,
Mm-hmm.
as far as I know. So people can create foundations, and they can do all kinds of creative things in terms of putting appreciated assets and
Right.
in different kinds of vehicles to get a tax deduction today and avoid having to pay those taxes personally.
Yeah.
So those things are just as valid yesterday as they are today.
I'd like to just point out there's my CPA Tom Willwright has got a podcast called Wealthability. He's talked a little bit about, which is an interesting one, and he's got some interesting takes on the tax bill as well. So that's another resource to check out there. So you mentioned land, right? So we recently had Mark Podolsky on the show. Was the land trading? Is this something you learned from Mark or what?
Yeah. So my little bit of my background, my family never had anyone that was crazy super wealthy, but because most of the people in my family were blue collar.
Mm-hmm.
My folks did quite a bit of rental real estate, and so in addition to the piles of cash, they made money through rentals as well. So I'm kind of following what they did, and they're millionaires,
Mm-hmm.
not multi millionaires, but they've done pretty darn well for themselves. And I had actually helped to manage one of their properties when I was in college, and the guy was in the Navy, and he was in and out. He was serving during the Gulf War, and I got so frustrated with trying to collect rent. It really turned me off from the whole idea of rental real estate.
Mm-hmm.
I said, I don't want to go through that again. That was such a pain and not worth my time and effort to do it. And so as I've been going on in my journey here, I really got into experimenting and trying different things. And on the podcast, I feature different guests with different ideas, much like you do.
Mm-hmm.
And Mark got on the podcast. He was one of his people had reached out to me to get him on the show. And I really liked the idea. This was over a year ago.
Yeah.
And so I was intrigued by it. I sat on it for about 3 months, and I kept on he gives these juicy numbers, right? Of like 300% to 600% rates of return. And like you're salivating at, what if I could do that? And so it sounded too good to be true, which we know often when something sounds too good to be true, it often is, right?
Right.
And so I went and did some due diligence and started just doing some of the stuff that he said to do. And I was able to do it, which was the first step of the land businesses getting lists from counties.
Yeah.
So I kind of got that done. And as a matter of fact, I had so freaking many of these lists, I got paralysis by analysis. And I had invested in his course, and his course is really good. There's lots of great information. Mark is kind of a take action, revise later, kind of ready, fire, aim kind of guy. And he says this as much on his podcast and all his materials. So he readily admits that. So it wasn't, there was tons and tons and tons and tons of great information in there, but it probably isn't organized the best, to be fair.
And now, which one did you do? Did you do the did you do I think there's like 3 levels of them, right? There's, did you do the one where, I think he just gives you a little bit of information, and then there's one that's flight school, and then there's the high level one. Which one did you do?
So I'm cheap, right? I don't want to go
Yeah.
spending tons of money. I'm into taking risk with little bits of money
Yeah.
and seeing if that works.
Yeah.
It's kind of biblically, you give a man a talent, can he turn it into two?
Yeah.
Some guy goes and hides it. You don't want to invest more. So I very much believe in giving a little bit at a time and seeing if it can multiply.
So you went with the cheap one.
I went with the cheap one.
But it worked. But you started making some money.
Well, I didn't start making money yet. I just did some of the research just to see could I even get past the initial step.
Yeah.
And so I did, but I got paralysis by analysis. So then I went. He has when you invest in the toolkit, you can go to the boot camp, which is a live event, and it doesn't cost you anything to do there because you already paid $1,000 or $1,200 or whatever it is for his toolkit. And so I went there with my wife. And you got to get the wife's approval on these kinds of things. So she bought into it. We were going to do it together, but she just didn't have the heart for it. So after I went to the boot camp, that really gave me the extra momentum and knowledge, which I think the boot camp is really more valuable than the toolkit itself, which you get 2 free tickets to go down to the boot camp. So I actually think the combination of those two is really awesome, and I'm glad Mark makes that available. I highly recommend if you get the toolkit, you got to go to the boot camp because that helps to fill in a lot of the gaps.
But so you've been doing this for about 6 months and you're making money though, right?
I am. Yeah. So I ended up trying it on my own and I got some deals done. So I started mailing in November, December. I bought 3 different pieces of property and I bought them for like $2,000 and I flipped them around for about $3,000. So I made $1,000 to start out with, which was great. It wasn't the 600% type return or the 300% type return even. I sold them wholesale,
right?
Just to kind of make a quick transaction. And now here we are. That was in January when I sold my first few. And then I went on a spree, a buying spree. And now I've bought 40 different properties. I've sold 37 of them. Of the 37, about 20 are on monthly payments. And that's how you get those juiced up 600% type returns where people pay you monthly over 6, 7, 8 years. And of course, there's a high chance of default with that because you're lending to people that can't get a credit card. So, you're charging them 10, 11, 12, 13% interest on the micro lending and you own the collateral. You can always foreclose. You've never deeded over the property to them. And then I've done some cash flips, wholesaling or selling just cash to retail buyers. So altogether, if everything turns out, I've invested at this point about $60,000 into land now over those 37 properties, and I expect to get back about $230,000 altogether.
Wow. And over what period of time?
It's just dependent. Some of those were immediate. Some of those are going to be paying over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years. So some are much longer, some are much shorter. It just depends on the property. Probably my best one was about 1,000% rate of return so far, if you get it over time. Generally the goal when you're doing note financing is you want to break even in a year, and then the other 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years are all pure profit without you having to do jack squat except collect the payment after that time.
Not bad. That's good. It's funny that, it's funny. Different people have such different philosophies about stuff. Because even just hearing you say, you took the toolkit because you're cheap and all that. I'm totally the opposite. And I'll just tell you, I think it's one of these approach things where I'll typically go to the one where they're going to hold my hand and I'm going to learn it as quickly as possible because I don't want to sit there and, try to figure things out for myself because I'm of the mindset that, it takes it takes mistakes to learn things, right? It does, but they don't have to be your mistakes. And so I'm willing to pay for other people's mistakes. And so that works, but you know what? That works for me. So it's just interesting that you said that. But philosophically, there's I guess there's just it's a difference, but it seems to work either way. But
well, it's really just about a time thing, right?
So, I like to compress time, right? That's for me. It's like when I value my time, I'm just I don't want to sit there and try to figure things out. I want somebody who already has done it, has already had success, tell me exactly what they know and how they did it. And if I have questions, I want to get them answered immediately. And that's kind of the way I approach those kinds of things. And as a result, I end up spending like, 6 figures a year on courses or masterminds, etc.
Right.
But for me, it's an investment. It's not a cost. It's totally an investment. So.
Well, and I think there's definitely something to that, and different strokes for different folks, for sure.
Yeah.
But I think the major issue I have is that you end up wasting a lot of money, and I hate waste. So, I'm the kind of guy that I eat leftovers, and my wife hates leftovers. She'll leave stuff in a bag. I'm like, we got to use that up. So
but,
I'm just,
but aren't you wasting money if you're wasting time and if you're doing things wrong and you didn't have to? Because that's the way I look at it, right? Is I look at it as, I'm going into a dark cave. I want to bring somebody with me who's been there before, and I'll pay him to be there, so I don't have to discover stuff for the first time.
Yes and no, because you still have to discover stuff yourself, right? Because they're not going to be with you 24/7. So, you look at some of those programs. I mean, there is a learning curve with this business as well as many other businesses. And there's not as much as they can guide you. They can help you to a degree, but you still got to learn on your own.
Sure.
So, and luckily today, we're blessed with so much free material. Mark has his own podcast where he talks about stuff. There's other podcasts like Seth Williams and another couple, Jack and Jill, that talk about this stuff. So I just fill myself with knowledge from all these people that I don't have to pay a single cent for.
Yeah.
And then as I get value, I pay money for it. So I'm learning from other people's mistakes. I'm just not having to pay tens of thousands.
Well, but then but in bringing that information together, there is a time value. And that, I think for me, that's fundamentally, and again, I'm not saying anything's right or wrong. It's just interesting how different people think about it differently. I'm always stepping up to the plate saying, okay, give it to me in a silver platter. Okay. Otherwise I don't want it. And it's worked for me, it's worked for me. So, anyway, listen, it was good having you on. A little spirited conversation here. A few differences in opinion are good for the show for sure. And tell us again where to find you.
Yeah, absolutely. You can find me at drfreedompodcast.com, which you have links to my books. My latest book, I actually haven't put up on the website yet, but you can find it at drfreedompodcast.com/docbook. So that's the latest one. And I hope to be doing more books. My next one I kind of want to do on thinking outside the box, talking about this land investing journey, the mobile gaming kit, business that I purchased, the $1 million acquisition I made 10 years ago that brought me to Minnesota. So I'm planning on doing more stuff, more materials, and would love to have people join me on the journey.
Cool. That sounds great. Well, thanks again for being on the show, Dave.
Thank you, Buck.
Be right back.